Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cosmic Perspective with Kevin Douglas. This episode today is going to be about flow states. We're going to be diving into the concept of what is the flow state, what the flow cycle is, how to get through the flow cycle, and what it can do for you in your day-to-day life, as well as how I personally had used the flow state to increase my performance in various things, and the ways that you can best use it yourself. Another big thing that I will make sure to refer you to is an awesome book that kind of gave me the holistic vision of what it is. I had been initially introduced to the concept through Shots of Awe with Jason Silva, who's the host of like Brain Games and his new show Origins about human species. So super awesome dude. Highly recommend you follow him. But in general, he introduced the concept to me, kind of pointed me in the direction of the authors of this book, and then the book itself gave me a really good, complete understanding of it. So this is just think of this as like to introduce you to the idea of it. Certainly don't take this as the end-all, be-all, because I am not a scientist, but definitely use the kind of intro that I'm going to give you here, and hopefully go do your own research and figure out what is the best way to get in the flow state for you, because it definitely varies, and it can go from somebody who's an action adventure sports athlete where your life is in literal danger, and I'll explain kind of what flow triggers are because that's kind of where that comes from. But either it's that, or it could be something creative where you're making music or you're freestyling, or it could even be something less artistic, but still is a flow state for you, right? Like coding. Not that there isn't an art to coding, but you get the idea. Kind of the more sciencey stuff, you certainly still can tap into that flow state. Your brain doesn't really discriminate the activity so much as it just needs to follow the certain recipe to get yourself there. So, first things first, for anybody that doesn't know what a flow state is, I'm going to give kind of a quick little overview of the idea of a flow state. You're probably familiar with it, but you might not have called it that. So as far as the flow state itself, the whole concept behind the flow state is that the prefrontal cortex, which is kind of that your self-editor, the voice in your head that you always hear, the voice that tends to doubt itself, right? The one that's telling you can't do it. That voice shuts down. So the prefrontal cortex, very front of your brain, that is what shuts down during flow. There's kind of a neurochemical dump, dopamine, serotonin, a whole bunch of feel-good chemicals that are dropping when you're actually in the flow state itself. However, the flow state is more than just that one aspect. It's actually a whole cycle that begins with kind of the introduction to your issue and ends with your recovering from that dump of all those chemicals. So the flow state itself, the whole idea behind the flow state, and it kind of had emerged decades ago, really centuries ago. People have kind of been aware of this state, but really didn't fully understand it. And a lot of the times people tended to associate these type of experiences that they went through to kind of a holy experience, definitely a spiritual one. And it does give you a sense of oneness because you lose that sense of self, at least temporarily. Hence, the term that they use is hypofrontality, hypo being the opposite of hyper. Hypo means it's shutting off, and then frontality is referring to the lateral prefrontal cortex. The whole idea behind the flow state when you're in it is to achieve the optimal human performance. So you want to get to the best version of yourself where you're not hesitating, but you're simply reacting. And it takes a little bit to get there. And this is where I was talking about the flow cycle. We're going to kind of go through the different phases of the flow cycle. So the very first part of the flow cycle is actually just identifying the problem and going through the struggle phase. So this is where you're maybe introduced to a new concept or to a new activity, and you have to learn the language of it, right? Nobody's an expert right away. Nobody knows exactly what they're doing from the get-go. And so it takes a little bit of time for you to learn the language. The first time you're playing music, for example, you probably don't know how to read notes. You probably don't know chords or progressions or any of the other aspects that go into music, right? You just kind of know music in general, and you know how sounds are, and you know that there are different instruments, but you don't really know the true language of how to construct it. And so that would be what we would consider the struggle phase. And I'll use music making as the example here, but you literally can apply this to any activity. So in this first step, you're learning it, you're practicing it, you're getting your skills up. You're getting yourself to go from this like conscious activity of like, okay, so I put my fingers here on the keyboard and then I move it like this to go up the scales, right? So something like that where you're just learning how to do it. It's kind of the muscle memory part. The second part of that is to get your mind off the issue. So you'll reach a certain point where your skill set is adequate. It's good enough, you know it well enough that you might even hit a wall, right? You might hit a point where you're like, man, I've come a long way, but I'm not really getting better. I'm not hitting that next phase. That's where this step comes in. And the idea behind it is go do something else. Literally anything but watching television. Television changes your brain waves, so it actually is the one activity you really can't do for this. But do something else. So it could be, I'll stick with the music example. So I'm playing music. That's kind of what I'm trying to do. That's how I'm trying to get into the flow state. I might then go draw. Or I might... playing with, this sounds funny, but playing with Legos, right? That's something that's engaging in a way where you're constructing stuff, you're building stuff, and it's a true like activity that you can get immersed in, but it's something that is not like super crazy with how it involves your mind, right? So it could be something like that. It could be something like going on a walk, right? Literally going on a walk. The same way that like when you're in the shower, all of a sudden a bunch of ideas pop in your head. It's the same kind of concept. So you're playing music, you hit your wall, you go out, maybe you draw, maybe you go on a walk, maybe you freestyle to reference back to the rapper side of things. Whatever that activity is, you do something that isn't the activity that you're trying to get better at. Usually you'll reach some novel conclusions that the other activity maybe draws some parallels to the activity that you're trying to learn. And it's really cool when you start to see that, because then you start realizing that the more brain connections that you're making from one activity to another, the more that you're able to see it from a new perspective and understand it that much deeper. The more neural connections that you can create to an activity, association, sound, smell, feelings, etc., the more you can do that, the more it solidifies that connection in your brain, the more you have a whole complete understanding of it. So you get to this point, you get through what we would consider the get your mind off the problem phase, and then you get to the point where now, okay, your skills are there, the conscious activity has kind of moved into the unconscious. You have a certain level of familiarity with the way that you should be doing it. So in the case of music construction, maybe you're just a lot more comfortable in the piano. Now you can kind of freestyle notes a little bit because you just know what notes sound good. And you get to the point where you literally get into the flow state. So the idea to get into the flow state is there's a magic number that, based on a ton of studies that they've done with various activities, studying flow and using MRI scans and everything, was you want to hit about 4% better than what you were just at. So that's not always easy to measure. Obviously, it would be easier to measure it if you were running, because you literally could be like, well, what is a 4% better time on my mile? But in general, you aim for about 4% outside of your current skill set. And generally, that is not so large that you can't make the leap. And it's actually large enough that then forces you to rise to the occasion. And this is where the flow state comes in, where you actually get the neurochemical dump. This is where everything kind of comes together, all of that practice, all of the preparation leading up to it, the getting your mind off the problem, creating the new connections. All of this comes together for this amazing moment of just pure bliss. I mean, flow states are 100% positive experiences. So, you do something else, you don't always get a full 100% satisfaction, right? You smoke weed, sometimes you panic. You do acid, sometimes you have a bad trip. Whereas something like flow, it's always positive. It always ends in feel-good chemicals, and it always ends in an amazing experience. And so when you get into this flow state, it can manifest itself in many ways. So for action adventure sports athletes, especially like somebody maybe climbing a mountain or skiing down a mountain or something where your life is literally in danger, you get this kind of 360 view of your environment. People who have had near-death experiences will report similar experiences where you're outside of your body. And there becomes this voice, this inner voice that you just listen to. You actually don't stop and think about it, right? It's just like left, right, and you just trust it. It's your instinct, and you just know that it knows what it's doing. And that's often how it's been described. And the book that The Rise of Superman that I'll refer you to later, I'll make sure I'll put the link in the description of this podcast. They talk about that. And they talk about different people who had that experience where there was a guy who was climbing a mountain that no one had done, and he did it without any safety equipment, which is like another, he's crazy. But did it without the safety equipment and literally heard the voice is how he referred to it as. And the voice was telling him, all right, now grab this ledge, now grab that ledge, and slowly guided him up to the top of the mountain and ended up having him climb a mountain that previously had not been climbed that way. So it's kind of an amazing thing, the way that it becomes this just pure instinct, but that instinct is based off of a lot of experience that you built up beforehand, right, in the struggle phase. So you get this amazing feel-good chemical dump. It's not super long-term sustainable. Your brain literally can't dump that many chemicals for too long. It eventually does run out. So there is a time limit. I believe the time limit was like 15 minutes, I think, is the maximum amount of time you can spend in that state before then you're out of the chemicals. And then you have to recover. And the recovery phase is honestly just as important as the struggle phase. So the recovery phase is basically where you need to get a solid night's rest. You need to eat some foods that are going to replace the chemicals, key vitamins and minerals that you need to incorporate in your diet after you have one of those experiences. And once you've gotten through that, then you're ready to hit the struggle phase again. And the only way to get into the flow state, which is the step that essentially is the best part of the flow cycle, you have to go through all the steps. You can't skip a step. It's just unavoidable. And they've repeatedly studied this in various activities at their what they call the Flow Dojo, and I believe it's in Texas. And it's basically like a big adult playground where people can play on different things like monkey bars and swings and stuff that trigger flow. So now that you know kind of what the flow cycle is and the whole premise of how it works, I kind of want to go into what flow can do for you personally. So when I first discovered this whole concept of flow, I was fascinated by it. It really was. I was like, damn, like there's an optimal human performance and there's a way that you can hack it. And being able to hack this cycle, really knowledge is power, right? So just half the battle is just like literally knowing that this is a cycle and that there's a way to game it. And once you kind of have that information, it ends up taking you to the next level because you're able to manipulate your brain chemistry based on biological responses that are programmed into your DNA. I mean, your body's going to react to this stuff regardless. It doesn't have that same conscious thought that you, the self, which, we could argue the self is an illusion. That's another conversation. But you, the self, is maybe more aware of it. The body's just reacting to stimuli. So if you trigger the right stimuli, you can actually hack yourself into this flow state more efficiently because you have this knowledge that it exists and you're able to kind of game the system, so to speak. So flow, when I was first introduced to it, it really made me want to get into it. It made me want to see like, well, how far can this push me, and how much better, faster, smarter, stronger, whatever I could be if I was starting to incorporate that into my routine. And there are various ways that you can do it. Now, in the book, they refer to a lot of things with flow triggers, and there are different things that can kind of trigger the flow state. Trigger alert. But there are triggers that you can kind of trigger the flow state that allow you to more likely get into these flow states. So what I did for my flow states, I had a few different activities that I did when I first discovered this that I felt like were all feeding into each other. And flow has this cool effect where the more flow that you get into, the more likely your brain is going to get into flow when you're doing other activities. So if let's say you're getting a lot of flow states from freestyling rapping, right? Which literally at a certain point you have to lose your self-editor to truly keep up with the rhythm of the beat. When you get to this flow state, it ends up feeding into other activities that also have the ability to get into the flow state. So you freestyle rap, and that gets you into the flow state, and then you go out on a run, and you can get that, runner's high flow state, which is kind of a lower level flow state compared to, climbing a mountain or something. So each one that you're doing, and every time you get into it, it becomes easier and easier for your brain to do that neurochemical dump because it's used to it. It's habitual. The same way that, you might get used to your cup of coffee in the morning. You're training your brain to go through this cycle more efficiently. So what I did is I used the cheap runner's high flow state. This is back when I could run. I have horrible knees. Unfortunately, I can't do it anymore. Now I just spend my time in the elliptical. But when I was running, I would go to, I went to a park because for me, I need to be running outside. If I'm going to be running, it's got to be out in nature. And this park was perfect for that. And you kind of need the novelty of it, right? So if you're just going into a gym and running on a treadmill, it becomes boring. It becomes mundane. And mundanity means that you're then shutting off your brain for certain aspects of it in a bad way. You need to be engaged in the activity that you're in. And so that's one of the flow triggers is novelty. So the whole idea behind these extreme sports athletes is that they're constantly seeking novelty because the second they start getting used to, for a skier, they get used to going down the same slope, it then becomes boring and they don't have to think about it. And not having to think is a good part of the flow state. However, you need to be engaged in what that activity is to the point where you're hyper-focused on the activity rather than like yourself per se. So you're more like paying attention to the path you're going down. You're more immersed in the actual act of carving or what have you. Again, just using skiing as the example for this. But that was something that worked for me. So this park, it was novel at least for a while. It worked for me for a while. There definitely was a point where I then couldn't use the path that I was using, but it certainly helped. And so there is a cool little cheat way that you can cheat the neurochemical dump in your brain for the flow state. So what I would do is I would run the trail, and the trail was about a mile. I would run the trail and I would sprint the finish. And the finish I considered the last probably 150 yards or so, and I would sprint it. Get myself into this mode where I'm no longer thinking. The whole concept of that first mile for me is to turn off the brain that's like thinking about like, oh, I got to do this today or do that. And you're just kind of like immersed in just putting one foot in front of the other, breathing, and making it to the end of the trail that you're running. Then in that break in between where I'm like, getting a sip of water, catching my breath again, I would, I'm a user of cannabis, so I would use. I had a vaporizer that I was using, and I would take a couple hits from the vaporizer at lower temps. So without getting too deep into the difference between vaping weed and smoking it, I was vaping it at a level that tends to keep you very clear-headed, alert, and a little bit more concentration focused. And obviously the strain you're using can also alter that, and you can mix and match, and that's something that I highly recommend just playing around with if you are a cannabis user. Play around with different temps, figure out what works for you. But for me, I was using the low-level temps. So I would get through this mile, hit the vape, take some sips of water. My mind really still wasn't thinking. I was kind of focused at the task at hand, ready to go for the next level. And I would run the second one. And the second one I ran, most of the time that I did this, and I did this for a summer, at least a couple times a week, I got into a flow state. I got into excuse me, I got into that runner's high that kind of gives you that hyper, like ultra, I want to call it ultra HD. It's almost like your vision turns to 4K a little bit. And I definitely got that towards the end, and a couple times almost threw up because of it. But it was getting me into flow states. So I used that as an activity to kind of hack it, because I knew that the neurochemistry could easily be cheated. Oh, I forgot to mention, caffeine is integral to that as well. So it's got to be a mix of caffeine, cannabis, and your brain shutting off. So, brain shutting off the inner editor. So that requires the run. That first mile for me is kind of that, turn the brain off part. So the combination of all of those, I was getting into flow states, and then there was other activities that I was doing as well. And it's funny that the other activity that I was using was video games, but I was playing Super Smash Brothers, the one on the Wii U, and I was playing it with one of my buddies who I've known since elementary school. Super cool dude, really knew a lot about the actual strategy of the game, and he taught me the language of it. So this was kind of the struggle phase for me when I was first playing it, was going from being a guy who was like pretty good at Smash, but definitely didn't play the way that like professional Smash players play, to then learning the language of the professional Smash players, learning spacing, learning the different characters, learning ending lag and dodges, and when to throw out punches, when to throw out grabs, just various counters, and kind of learning the language of the actual strategy of the game, especially when it comes to like frames and understanding how the game was coded, right? So that was the struggle phase for me. The very beginning of the summer, I was learning that, and he would kick my ass repeatedly. But I was learning, and he was testing me in ways that, a good player is going to throw moves out at you. So I was using Smash because it had novelty, right? Every time that you're playing the game, you're getting a different mashup, and you're getting, depending on the type of moves that the person you're playing is throwing out, you're always getting a new experience. And so that actually really helped with the novelty side of things for the flow triggers. One of the other flow triggers that's really important for actually causing yourself to go from just doing the activity to all of a sudden shifting into this crazy flow state is that you need to have risk. You need to have this fear of, it could be death, but it doesn't have to be death. So it could be literal death, like you're climbing a mountain, and if you don't make this grab, then you will die and fall to your death. That will work pretty much every time, assuming you did all the prep for the first couple steps in the cycle. Or it can be something like social death. It could be something where maybe you're doing a public speech, and you're like concerned about looking like an idiot in front of 1,000 people or whoever you're speaking to. That is just as good. Your brain doesn't know the difference between a tiger attacking you and social death through embarrassment on being streamed live on YouTube or something. So you again, we're cheating the biology here, because these are just biologically programmed responses that we know it's going to do, and we can use our awareness of those responses to make them work towards our benefit, essentially. So what I was doing with Super Smash was I finally learned the language. I started to get pretty good at it, and again, I will say I used cannabis in this as well, where we would get ourselves into the zone, and then we would play for hours. And just doing different matchups. And I eventually got to the point where, I caught up to him. And now he is definitely still better than me, and he's definitely still been better than me. But I started winning sometimes. I was starting to be able to get some wins from him. And it was because I was getting flow from multiple sources. And like I said before, the more flow you have, the more flow you can get. So because I was doing it in multiple activities, I was kind of going into flow overdrive that summer, where I was constantly doing it, and I was super aware of the process. So I always kind of knew where I was at. And if I was ever stuck in one activity, I would use the other activity to push myself to the next boundary. So that kind of was where I was using the get your mind off the problem phase with one and substituting the other. So anytime I hit that point after finishing the struggle phase with Smash, then I did it with running and vice versa. So I took that novelty. I took the threat of losing the match, which for me was kind of that fear of death simulated response, and I was able to push that level where now I would say I'm pretty good at Smash. I like to think I can hold my own, and I certainly know how to play strategically. And I have a few different characters that I'm pretty badass with. Good luck. I'd love to play you guys if anybody wants to play me, but. Yeah, so that was kind of that was how I personally used the flow state and how I got myself into it and really started training my brain to get into it more. And I found that it was feeding into a lot of other things. I apologize for the siren in the background here. I live in a pretty crazy area here in the city. But so anyway, so the triggers that I was getting myself into, the fact that I was able to get myself into this state where I was constantly in flow for something all summer, it was starting to help me with other stuff. I was starting to learn things faster, and that's actually one of the aspects of flow is that they managed to train snipers from beginner level to experts in half the time that it normally takes. So that mythical 10,000 hours doesn't have to be 10,000 hours if you're using the flow cycle to do it. You actually can accelerate that process and become an expert much quicker than you ever could with just traditional methods of just doing the same activity over and over and over again through pure repetition and practice. So this is a totally different way of learning things, but at the same time is the most efficient way of learning that we have yet to discover for humans and the way that our brain works. So what essentially your brain is doing when it's in this mode is it's trading conscious processing for subconscious processing. And conscious processing is inefficient. It's definitely energy inefficient, and it's slower. It takes time to get there. Whereas unconscious processing is very quick. It's very efficient in terms of energy, and it allows you to truly get a deeper understanding of things because it's unconscious, right? Your brain, if you ever had a crazy dream, your brain is just doing that in real time. It's creating this entire world for you to live in, these little movies at night. And it's kind of the same thing when you're tapping into this unconscious processing of your brain. And you can do the same thing with drugs, right? So there are ways that you can use them and you can get that similar high, but it's not as long lasting. And it's also harder to take more away from it when you're doing that. But it certainly does help, and every little bit helps. And I will say I was experimenting with psychedelics specifically at this time. So it was kind of a mix of the flow state. I was using mindfulness and meditation, which is another way to tap into it, but it is a much slower method than the traditional flow cycle. And then on top of it was using like LSD and magic mushroom, psilocybin. And when I combined kind of all of these, I was able to take more and more away from that state of mind and apply it to my regular waking state. So my normal state of mind now is a lot more psychedelic in nature because I've consciously been trying to bring those things back from that state and keep myself in that zone while I'm maybe just sober, like purely sober. So super cool, super amazing concept, and really was a game changer for me. That year, I swear, I learned more things in that year. I was more efficient, more open, happier, and was able to do a lot more stuff because of this whole novel idea. And I was obsessed with it. I'm the type of person who, when I first learn about something, I dive really deep into it. I'm a huge nerd in that way. And so I was just... I probably annoyed the shit out of everybody where I couldn't stop talking about it, but it was because it was such a game changer for me, and it was so obvious the effects that I was seeing from it, where I really felt like I went from, Kevin 1.0 to Kevin 2.0. I really do feel like I now learn things much faster than I ever did because I use this flow cycle to my advantage. So that was something that I thought was really cool. And I think there are a lot of ways that you can engineer your life, and that's kind of the way that I had looked at it at that time, was engineering my life around the flow cycle so that everything I was doing was pushing me further along in it. So there's a lot of ways that you can do that in your life. Again, using novelty is a big thing. So driving a different way home from work, that forces you to be engaged. It forces you to pay attention to the roads, and you need to have that close attention so that you then are not thinking about yourself and you're thinking more about the activity. Brushing your teeth with the opposite hand also has that same effect because you have to be more conscious of it, right? You're always brushing your teeth with your right hand. If you're right-handed, you're not thinking about it, right? It's like a thing that you've just done every day, 2 times a day, that it's just unconscious. But you start doing it with your other hand, and now all of a sudden you got to think about how you're brushing your teeth. You got to think about, did I cover all these teeth? Did I brush it enough? And that's a really big aspect of flow, is you have to be at that level where you're genuinely thinking about it. So I had done that where I was doing different things that were more novel to me on a day-to-day basis. And then also, like I had said before, using running and smash as kind of my other ways of tapping into that cycle. So with the flow state in the feedback loops, there's a lot of ways that you can engineer your time to work for you. So it's kind of that whole work smarter, not harder, or kind of like using your money, for example. Using your money to make money rather than you having to earn every dollar to have your dollars earn dollars. It's kind of the same thing. You want every activity you're doing to be on some level earning you more than just the effort you're putting into it. What I did personally was I focused a lot about my spaces and designing my spaces, and so that I felt good. That was something that I really learned when experimenting with psychedelics, was that the space that you're in largely determines how that trip feels. So if you're in a room and you're having some negative thoughts, let's say you just took some LSD and you're in a room that has some creepy architecture or some scary looking shit, you're going to start feeling scared, so you're a little bit more tuned into the effects that the room has on you when you're on those drugs. But that being said, that effect is real regardless of whether you're on the drugs or not. And so once you start realizing that, then you start engineering your spaces to work more towards pushing you into that zone. So when it comes to engineering a space, I think a huge aspect of it is being clean. I'm a clean person. You can ask anybody who's ever lived with me. I keep things super clean. I always make my bed in the morning. Things like that work for me because it's a positive feedback loop, right? I do it in the morning. I feel good about it. Then my room looks good. I feel good when I'm in my room, right? It's a positive feedback loop. Each thing is feeding into one another. So when you are able to design your day-to-day activities to all do things like that, where it's this positive domino effect, you actually can really tap into this inner efficient version of yourself, where all the things that used to distract you or derail you now no longer can, because that's not how you engineered your day. Going to the gym every morning, it's a good way to get it out of the way early, and a good way to have those feel-good chemicals released for you, because you get a nice dopamine release after going to the gym. So again, you're engineering everything you do in your day-to-day life to constantly be feeding back into itself. So it eventually becomes this big momentum machine. It's like a train that never needs to stop, right? It's a train that never needs to drop passengers off because it's just going. And basically every time you create an activity that gives you a positive feedback loop, you're then adding more coal into the engine. For the metaphor here. So that was something that I thought was major in terms of how I started viewing life and what I could do about it. I thought it was a game changer. I mean, I really was able to spend my time a lot more wisely because of it. You take all these positive feedback loops, you start following the flow cycle. The more flow you get, the more flow you're more likely to have. And then eventually you hit a point where, you're just grooving. even when you're struggling, you're in the struggle phase. Because you know it's the struggle phase, it doesn't stress you out as much. And when you know you're in the recovery phase, you know that, okay, I need to sleep. I need to get some a good night's rest. I need to eat some good healthy foods and replenish those chemicals. And then once you feel like it's given enough time, then you're ready for the struggle phase again. And when you know that that's it, you have the expectation. That I think expectations are so big. But when you have this expectation where you know, like, listen, I know I'm not going to be good for this next however long this is going to take, right? However long it takes you to get through that particular phase. When you know that that's where you're at, you're not worried about not being as good as you want to be, because you know that that's a literal required phase for you to get through. And when you do hit that wall, then you know, oh, it must be that time where I need to get my mind off the problem. So then you do another activity. That other activity informs how you should then reapproach the new activity or the old activity. And you come back to the old activity and bam, you hit that magic 4% number. You get into your flow state. You have the feel good chemical dump. It feels amazing. You know that you were in the flow state. And then you're able to recover. And the flow state changes depending on the activity you're in. So for runners and stuff, you literally feel it in the moment that you're running it. But for somebody like a writer, when I was trying to write my show before I moved to Chicago, I was in a flow state for weeks, where it wasn't like this crazy like 360 view version, but it certainly was where I was able to literally write for hours every day, no problem. Like I was not sitting there like writer's block or anything. It just kind of flowed out of me, and it was because of all the prep that I did beforehand, of really visualizing my show, thinking about my characters, thinking about how I wanted to test them, thinking about plot lines I knew I wanted to cover. And eventually, once I had this holistic vision of the show, writing the first episode became easier. I already knew the perspective these characters would have. I knew what they would say in these different situations. And so then I would put myself into this zone where I could just sit there and write. So for different activities, you're going to have different definitions of the flow state, but it can be sustained for a long time. I mean, so Steven Kotler, the author of The Rise of Superman, he talked about how he wrote his next book like essentially in a few weeks because he was able to get into this flow state. So it's the same thing. It varies from activity to activity. But once you start recognizing it for yourself, then you can acknowledge that you're in it. And then okay, good. Like, let's take advantage of this while I have it before I then run out of my neurochemical dump and need to then recover and move on to the next phase to elevate to the next level. But it really is. It's an amazing concept. It's something that really changed my life. I think it's something that could change yours. And when you apply it in the right way, you really can become almost like Superman, hence the name of the book. So definitely check out the book, The Rise of Superman, Decoding Ultimate Human Performance by Steven Kotler. They have a follow-up book, but I think The Rise of Superman is better at really introducing the concept. And I think after you've read it, if you want to read the newer book, you can, because I read them both and they were both great. But certainly The Rise of Superman is a little bit more comprehensive in terms of the introduction of it. But the new book has more info about what they learned since that book, because they've been consistently studying this stuff with fMRI machines and with their Flow Dojo that they created with the adult playground. So definitely check it out. There's a great, I will also link it in the description. There's a great video where he talks about the book, kind of gives like a nice little summary. I think it's a good intro if you want to like listen to that first. It's about an hour long. It's a Google talk. So he went to Google to kind of explain this concept to them. A lot of Silicon Valley companies are super into the idea of flow states, and they actually design their offices with flow states in mind because, like I had said before, the environment is important. There are certain designs that can inspire awe. You go into an amazing cathedral, it's meant to be ethereal. It's meant to have that godlike feeling to it. Same thing with designing your spaces. You want to design them in a way that you can more easily get into this state of awe. So definitely check it out. Use this information to hopefully take yourself to the next level, no matter what your activity, what your passion is, whether it's science or art or athletics, whatever your thing is, you can use this flow state to make yourself better at it. And you can do it in half the time that it normally would have taken you with traditional methods. definitely check it out. That's going to be the podcast for this episode. But definitely let me know what you think of it. Let me know if that was helpful to you, if it was a new concept that you never heard of, or if you're familiar with it and I gave you a perspective on it that maybe you didn't think about before. I'd love to hear the feedback. But you guys have a good rest of your day.